Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum is undergoing its most dramatic transformation since opening nearly 50 years ago. With new exhibits that spotlight the future of flight and space exploration, from Mars habitats to commercial spacecraft, the museum is shifting its focus from history to possibility. It's a bold reimagining, timed to coincide with America's 250th birthday in 2026. Here to give us the inside details is the museum's curator of Earth and Planetary Science, Dr. Matt Schindel. Dr. Schindel, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Terry. I'm glad to be here.
I want to start with just the scale of the transformation of the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum. I know when people come to visit me in D.C., it's always on their top list of places to go. And you're about 2/3 of the way through this renovation. What has it taken logistically and creatively to bring this vision to fruition?
Well, I mean, it's been several years of work. Even before we broke ground on this revitalization of the building and the transformation of all of the galleries inside, there were already years of planning that went into undertaking this. And so really the whole staff of the museum has been involved, especially people at my level. All of the curators have been involved in just rethinking every gallery that we have in the museum, the ones that we continue to have in sort of newer, updated versions, and ones that are new to the museum, like the Futures in Space exhibition that we've just opened as one of the 5 newest galleries. And as you said, we still have 7 more galleries to open before we're completely finished with this renovation and reimagining of the museum. And that'll take place on July 1st of 2026.
It's hard to imagine that museum is almost 50 years old. What has been the change in kind of museum science and presentation that you all have had to deal with as you've planned the modernization?
You know, in addition to what changes have happened in the field of museum science, there's also a big change. I think the main change that our renovations reflect is the fact that both aviation and spaceflight now have a much longer history than they did in 1976 when we first opened, right? Spaceflight was not very old at that point. Human spaceflight was only about 15 years old when the museum opened. And so, at this point, there is more of a history and there's more of a field of space history that has developed. And the same is true for the history of aviation, even though aviation had a longer history than spaceflight. There's been a lot of change in the ways that we approach history. We now think a lot more about social and cultural aspects of both aviation and spaceflight than we did when the museum first opened, where I think that the museum did have an emphasis on some of those cultural and social dimensions. Now I think it's a bigger part of the stories that we tell. And we really, to a much greater degree than we used to, try to tell the story of the people who are involved, not just the sort of record breakers or the people who performed the firsts in aviation and spaceflight, but the communities of people who have made aviation and spaceflight possible, and those of us who have, watched it maybe from the sidelines and have had impacts on our life that are a little bit more indirect than those who work in aerospace. So the stories we tell now, I think, are a lot more holistic than the stories that we were telling back in the 70s.
So how did you decide which stories to tell as you did the renovation? Obviously, your space is still the same amount of space, and yet you have much more history to tell. How did you decide which stories go in, which stories don't make it in?
I mean, that's a big question. It's hard to answer as one curator because every gallery had a team of people that worked on it that decided which stories were going to go in. And I wouldn't say there was one philosophy. I would say it starts with the artifacts. We have some incredible artifacts in our collection, and we tell the stories around those artifacts. And then identifying the right people to include in those stories often meant just sort of thinking about who are the kind of remarkable individuals when you look beneath the sort of the surface of who flew the plane or, who managed the mission in the case of space exploration to kind of the people on the ground doing the work. And finding examples among those many stories that you could possibly tell where there are photographs and where you have like a more complete story that you can tell about an individual who can then represent the larger story of the community that worked to make that milestone possible.
Did you get any public feedback on the stories that were most of interest to the general population?
Oh, that's a good question. We get a lot of feedback all the time, whether it's through our website or through talking to visitors on the floor of the museum. And I think different visitors are attracted to different stories, right? You don't ever hear the same thing from everyone. So I think a lot of people have really gravitated towards the story, of course, of the Apollo astronauts. But I think one of the stories that I think people sometimes find surprising and that I'm really happy we have in our Destination Moon Gallery is the story of the women who worked at ILC Dover who did all of the hand sewing on those spacesuits and the spacesuit gloves in particular, where there was so many very detailed stitches that had to be done to make each glove custom to each astronaut. And having the story of those women and having some of the women in our video kiosk that goes along with that display tell the story of the work and what it meant to them when the astronauts would come in for their glove fittings and for other things. I think that is a very powerful thing that we're now able to do that's very new to the museum that I think, really is something that a lot of visitors can engage with on a level that's different from engaging with, the Neil Armstrong suit itself. Thinking about the work and the number of people and people hours that went into creating a suit that would keep Armstrong alive on the moon. I think that's a very powerful story.
I'm speaking with Dr. Matt Schindel. He's the curator for Earth and Planetary Science at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum and co-host of the Airspace podcast. So the renovation isn't just about the exhibits, but it's also about reimagining, as you've sort of talked about, how people experience the aerospace history. What sort of design choices went into this to make the museum more accessible and immersive?
Well, immersive is exactly the right word. One of the things that we're able to do now that wasn't really possible in the 70s when the museum first opened is to create immersive experiences that people can walk through and then be surrounded by aspects of aviation and spaceflight history. So, in the first gallery that I worked on during this renovation, the Exploring the Planets gallery, we have a wonderful walkthrough called Walking on Other Worlds, where we're able to take you to 7 different places in the solar system where spacecraft have visited and collected data, and we can recreate those planetary surfaces or the surface of a comet or asteroid based on that data with a little bit of artistic license to make it sort of an immersive experience. But to give you the sense that you're standing on that surface and having a 360-degree sort of view of the horizon around you. And, that's a really powerful type of immersive that does transport visitors to these other places where, in most cases, other than the moon, no human has yet set foot. And so we can create that experience. And then in the newer gallery that we just opened, where I was the lead curator, the Futures in Space gallery, we have another walkthrough immersive experience that takes you inside of the lives of people who have lived through simulated Mars missions and who are able to tell us what the biggest challenges were to living in sort of this Mars analog habitat for a week at a time, or in one case for more than a year. What were the biggest challenges? How did they overcome them? And then projecting forward, what do they think the actual astronauts who go on a Mars mission will actually have to deal with, and how will they potentially solve those problems? So, we use that experience to address that sort of human dimension of sending people to other worlds and to, in a sense, get inside of the heads of people who have gone through those simulated missions. And so far, I think visitors have really enjoyed that experience just as much as the Walking on Other Worlds experience. So that's the sort of immersive type of thing we're able to build now that we never did before. And it just adds another dimension to the type of storytelling we're able to do, in addition to putting the artifacts, the spacesuits, the spacecraft in front of the visitor to actually get them to sort of, inhabit a space or an idea through this immersive experience.
That is very cool and really seems to embrace the technology that goes along with the space and aerospace world as well. You still have a few more galleries to work on before the renovation is complete, scheduled in 2026. What will the final phase include, and what do you want people to be looking forward to?
Yeah, so, on the space side of things, we're going to be opening up a gallery called At Home in Space that's about, the International Space Station and sending humans into low Earth orbit to work and to live. We have a larger sort of atrium gallery called Living in the Space Age that, shows visitors all of the ways in which their lives are connected to the space infrastructure that we've built over these past decades. And we have our astronomy gallery, Discovering Our Universe, which will, really show visitors how all of these generations of space telescopes and other types of space science that we've done either from the ground or in orbit have transformed our view of our universe and increased our understanding of where we are. And then we have the World War II gallery and the Modern Military Aviation gallery coming as well as part of that. And the museum's art gallery will open again as a place where we can showcase some of the thousands of works of art that we have in our museum's collection.
I've been speaking with Dr. Matt Schindel. He's curator for Earth and Planetary Science at the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum and co-host of the Airspace podcast. Thank you so much for joining me. There's so much still to look forward to.
Yes, thank you very much.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.